It is exactly 3:14 a.m. on a humid Tuesday in July 2026. The silence in the room is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical wheezing of an oxygen concentrator, a sound that has become the haunting soundtrack to the twilight years of a man who once commanded the screens of millions. Kanayo O. Kanayo, the legendary veteran of Nollywood, sits in the dimly lit corner of his residence. His face, once etched with the familiar intensity of his iconic roles, is now lined with the unmistakable exhaustion of a man fighting a war he wasn't prepared for. At 64, the Nanyi sacrifice is paying a price that no script could have ever predicted. For months, whispers have been circulating through the corridors of the entertainment industry like a contagion. The man known for his stern gaze and calculated characters is reportedly battling a series of debilitating age-related ailments that have stripped away his vitality. Sources close to the actor claim that his once robust frame has withered, leaving him fragile. But the physical pain, as agonizing as it is reportedly eclipsed by a far sharper blade, the ache of profound isolation. According to those familiar with his private life, the walls of his home have become a cold, echoing sanctuary. There are growing reports that his wife, Nneka Onyekwere, and their children have stepped away from the picture during his most desperate hour. It is a narrative that feels ripped from the very tragedies he once portrayed. A man who gave his life to his craft, only to be left to face the sunset in solitude. The timeline of this slow-motion heartbreak traces back to the early months of this year. Insiders suggest that as the symptoms of his illnesses began to manifest, the tremors, the fatigue, the nights spent staring at the ceiling waiting for the sun to rise, the domestic harmony that once anchored his life began to fray. It is alleged, one source whispered, that the pressures of caregiving and the weight of his changing health created a chasm that could not be bridged. What started as disagreements over treatment plans is said to have evolved into a complete severance of ties. Imagine the scene. The man who taught a generation the gravity of consequence now finds himself living the ultimate consequence of estrangement. It is said that there have been days when the only visitors to his bedside are the shadows lengthening against the wall. The irony is as thick as the tension in the room. In his films, Kanayo O Kanayo was often the puppet master, the one pulling the strings of destiny. Now, he is reportedly a bystander to his own story, watching as the people he sacrificed everything for turn their backs. There are details that make the heart stutter. Reports suggest that in moments of extreme delirium, he has been heard calling out names that remain unanswered in the stillness of the house. Neighbors have allegedly noted the absence of the bustling energy that used to define his home. The vibrant family man, the celebrated icon, is now a man living in the echoes of what used to be. Why would they leave? The rumors are rampant and unkind. Some suggest it was a long-standing resentment finally boiling over under the pressure of his deteriorating health. Others say it was a mutual realization that the life they built together had become a vessel for resentment rather than support. Whatever the truth, the optics are devastating. The man who portrayed the ultimate patriarch is reportedly dying in a house that no longer feels like a home, with his wife and children existing as ghosts in his memory rather than pillars by his side. He sits there now, his fingers, knotted and thin, tracing the fabric of a worn armchair. The medication sits on the side table, a colorful array of pills that offer survival, but not solace. He doesn't look at the awards gathering dust on the mantel. He doesn't look at the scripts he will never act again. His gaze is fixed on the heavy mahogany door, the one that leads to the hallway. It hasn't opened in days. There is no sound of footsteps, no smell of a home-cooked meal drifting from the kitchen, no laughter to puncture the suffocating quiet. The moonlight filters through the curtains, casting bars across his chest like the shadows of a prison cell. He is a man who owned the screen, who commanded attention with a mere raise of an eyebrow. Yet in this moment, he is utterly invisible to the world that once idolized him. The oxygen machine hums, a steady, unfeeling pulse in the dark. He reaches for a glass of water, his hand shaking violently, and for a fleeting second, the glass slips. It doesn't break, but the sound of it hitting the wooden table rings out like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence. He doesn't move to pick it up. He just stares at the door, waiting for a presence that never comes, while the clock on the wall ticks away the seconds of a legacy that is slipping into the abyss, one quiet breath at a time. The air in the room feels thick, saturated with the scent of antiseptic and stale, unmoving air. It is a sterile smell that mocks the vibrant, chaotic life he once lived under the bright, unforgiving studio lights. Kanayo O. Kanayo shifts his weight, the leather of the armchair groaning in protest, a sound that, in this oppressive silence, feels like a thunderclap. He tries to rub his temples, but his fingers, once steady enough to manipulate the most complex of his on-screen deceptions, are now plagued by a persistent rhythmic tremor. It is a humiliating betrayal of his own body. He remembers the script days, the camaraderie, the smell of heavy stage makeup, the frantic energy of a film set where he was the king of the scene. He remembers the feeling of a heavy velvet agbada draped over his shoulders, the weight of gold rings on his fingers, the absolute certainty of his own authority. Now he wears a faded cotton robe that hangs loosely on his thinning frame. The transition from the legendary Nani sacrifice to this frail shell is a narrative arc that no screenwriter would dare write. It is too cruel, too final. He turns his head slowly, his neck muscles straining. On the side table, tucked behind the bottle of pills, sits a silver-framed photograph. It is a family portrait, a relic from a time when the laughter in this house was real, not just a phantom memory he chases in his dreams. In the photo, Neka looks radiant, her head resting gently on his shoulder, their children smiling with the kind of innocence that hasn't been tarnished by the harsh light of reality. He reaches out to touch the glass, his thumb hovering over her face. He wonders if she ever looks at a similar photo on her own dresser, or if she has turned them all face down, burying the memory of the man she allegedly left behind to rot in this gilded cage. According to the few voices that still reach him from the outside world, the narrative of his abandonment has become a public sensation. People talk, they speculate, they dissect his misery as if it were a plot point in his next big thriller. Does she know that they are talking about her? Does she care that the man she promised to stand by, through sickness and health, as the ancient vows insisted, is now reduced to counting the slats in the window blinds to track the passing of days? The silence is interrupted by a sudden sharp ache in his chest, a stabbing reminder of the ailments that are methodically dismantling him. He gasps, the sound ragged and wet, and grips the edge of the table. The water glass he dropped earlier lies on its side, a small puddle spreading slowly across the dark wood, seeping into the grain like ink on a page. He stares at the spreading moisture, transfixed by its slow, inevitable creep. It reminds him of his life, once solid, once contained, now spilling out uncontrollably toward the edge. He imagines her entering the room. He crafts the scene in his mind, a mental script he revisits 1,000 times a day. The door would creak, a familiar welcoming sound. She would walk in, carrying a tray with tea, the steam curling into the air. She would look at him not with the pity that others offer, but with that familiar knowing look she used to give him when he was exhausted after a 16-hour shoot. But the door remains shut. The hinges are silent. The hallway remains a void, a dark corridor leading to nowhere. He wonders if his children ever pause before they go to sleep, wondering if he is still breathing in this room. Do they think of him as the hero of their childhood, or have they successfully rewritten their own history to justify their absence? The thought is a venom that burns deeper than the physical pain. It is said that he once tried to call out to them, to break the silence, but the words withered in his throat, lost in the vast, empty space between his chair and the hallway. Outside, the wind begins to pick up, rattling the window pane in its frame. It sounds like someone knocking, a frantic, desperate plea from the outside world trying to get in. He turns his gaze to the window, his eyes watering. The reflection in the glass is unrecognizable, a ghost of the man who once held the world in his palm. He sees the sagging jawline, the hollowed-out cheeks, the eyes that have lost their predatory spark. He is no longer the villain, the king, or the victim. He is just a man waiting for the final cut to be called. The oxygen machine hums on, indifferent to his existential crisis. He closes his eyes, trying to summon the sound of her voice, trying to recall the specific timbre of her laugh, but even that is starting to fray at the edges, dissolving into the white noise of his solitude. The room feels smaller now, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching out like long, thin fingers reaching for him. He pulls the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, his breath hitching as a sudden cold draft snakes across the floor. He remains motionless, a silhouette against the moonlight, waiting for a savior who isn't coming, while the house breathes around him. A hollow, empty chest that has long since forgotten what it means to be a home. The rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator seems to change pitch, shifting from a mechanical drone to something almost rhythmic, like a distorted heartbeat. It is 4:02 a.m. In the dark, the boundaries between reality and the cinematic tragedies he built his career upon have blurred into a singular, suffocating haze. Kanayo stares at the floor, where the water from the spilled glass has finally stopped spreading. It forms a dark, irregular Rorschach test on the mahogany, and for a moment he is convinced it looks like the map of a place he can no longer reach. A home that was never really his, or perhaps a home he unknowingly burned down a long time ago. There are rumors, circulating in hushed tones within the industry, that his estrangement is not merely a consequence of illness, but the result of a secret that was unearthed. A skeleton that had been rattling in his closet for decades, finally breaking through the drywall. Whether this is true, or merely the morbid imagination of a public hungry for the downfall of an icon, remains a mystery that gnaws at the edges of his sanity. He remembers a phone call, or does he? A voice, cold and detached, telling him that the silence he is currently enduring is the price of the past. Was it Neka? Or was it the projection of his own guilty conscience manifesting as a phantom caller? The house itself seems to conspire against him. Sometimes he hears movement in the hallway, not the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a family, but light, skittering sounds that defy logic. He has tried to shout, to demand answers from the shadows, but his voice is thin, a brittle reed that snaps under the weight of his own desperation. He wonders if he is being watched, not by his family, but by something else, something that has been waiting for him to reach this exact state of vulnerability. The darkness in the corners of the room feels thick, like liquid ink, and he finds himself avoiding looking directly into them, terrified of what might be looking back. A stack of unopened mail sits on the floor near the door. Among the bills and the legal notices, there is one envelope, thick and cream-colored, that has remained untouched for weeks. It bears no return address, only his name written in a script so precise, so unnervingly familiar, that it makes his skin crawl. He hasn't opened it. He knows, with the intuitive dread of a man who has played too many villains, that opening it would be the final act, the plot twist that would either grant him mercy or seal his fate permanently. Is it a letter from Neka? A final confession? Or is it a document of his own undoing? He hears a soft click, the sound of a light switch being flipped in the kitchen, down the long, shadowed corridor. He holds his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Is someone there? Did she return? Or is it just the house settling, the old wood groaning under the weight of his secrets? He calls out, "Neka?" But the name hangs in the air, hollow and unconvincing. Silence follows, heavier than before, suffocating, absolute. The mystery of his isolation is compounded by the fact that he has not reached out for help. He has a phone, a device that could summon a dozen assistants, a swarm of journalists, or a legion of fans with a single tap. Yet it sits on the floor, its screen dark and cold, ignored. Why? Is he protecting them? Or is he protecting himself from the shame of having them see him like this? The air in the room feels charged, electric, as if the very atmosphere is waiting for him to make a move, to choose a path, to break the seal on that cream-colored envelope. He shifts his gaze back to the window. A car passes by in the distance, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling like a searchlight. For a fleeting second, the light illuminates a silhouette standing on the lawn, a figure still and upright, looking directly up at his window. He freezes, his breath catching in his throat. When the car passes and the light vanishes, the lawn is empty again. Was it a neighbor? A fan? Or a ghost from his past, checking to see if the nanny has finally breathed his last? He leans his head back against the chair, the exhaustion pulling at his eyelids, yet he refuses to sleep. To sleep is to surrender, and he suspects that if he closes his eyes for too long, the silence of the house will become his permanent reality. He stares into the darkness, listening for the next sound, waiting for the door to creak, wondering if the man who lived 1,000 lives on screen is about to lose the only one that truly mattered. Outside, the wind begins to howl, masking the sound of a key, perhaps, slowly, agonizingly, turning in the lock of the front door. Or is it just the wind? He grips the armrests, his knuckles white, and waits, his entire existence suspended in the trembling space between the light of the hallway and the encroaching dark. The key does not turn. It never turns. The metallic scraping sound Kanayo thought he heard was merely the house's frame contracting in the cooling night air, a symphony of settling timber mocking his desperate hope. He remains frozen, his eyes locked onto the door handle, the moonlight painting it in a shade of cold, unforgiving silver. If it were a scene in one of his movies, the music would swell now, a low, discordant cello note rising to a crescendo, signaling a confrontation, a revelation, or an end. But this is the quiet, agonizing reality of the 64th year, where there is no soundtrack, only the erratic, wet rattle of his own lungs. He looks back at the cream-colored envelope on the floor. It seems to have shifted, or perhaps his eyes are playing tricks on him. It looks slightly closer than it was before, as if the floorboards themselves are conspiring to push it toward his feet. He knows that if he just stood up, if he could find the strength in his atrophied legs to traverse those few yards, he could solve the riddle. He could know once and for all why the house is silent, why Neka isn't coming, and whether the life he cultivated was a masterpiece or a mirage. But to know is to lose the luxury of the maybe. As long as that envelope remains sealed, the possibility remains that this is all a misunderstanding, a cruel cosmic joke that will be undone by the sunrise. His gaze wanders to the mirror across the room, a large, ornate piece that has hung there for decades. In the dim light, his own reflection looks like a stranger, a man wearing Kanayo's skin but possessing none of his fire. He wonders if he ever truly existed, or if he was simply a collection of roles, a series of masks that he wore so convincingly that he eventually forgot where the makeup ended and his true face began. Is this the ultimate sacrifice he was always meant to perform? To be erased, bit by bit, until there is nothing left but the echo of a performance? A shadow moves in the periphery of his vision. He turns his head, the movement slow and painful, his joints popping in the oppressive stillness. There is nothing there, yet the air in the room feels displaced, as if someone, or something, has just stepped out of the way. He hears a sound then, faint and rhythmic. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not at the door, but from beneath him, from the floorboards, or perhaps from the very walls themselves. It is a steady, insistent pulse, like a clock counting down to an event that has already occurred. He reaches for his phone one last time, his fingers hovering over the glass screen. The battery icon glows a faint, dying red. He hesitates. If he presses the button, does he alert the world to his misery? Or does he confirm that there is no one left to call? He imagines the screen lighting up to show a stream of notifications, messages he missed, calls he ignored, or, most terrifyingly, an inbox that is completely, devastatingly empty. Outside, the first hint of gray light begins to bleed into the horizon. The dawn is coming, indifferent to his struggle. It will bring the world, the noise, and the demands of a life he can no longer sustain. He looks at the water glass on the table, still lying on its side, the liquid now almost entirely evaporated, leaving behind a faint mineral stain, a residue of something that was once refreshing, but is now just a ghost of itself. He feels a strange sensation in his chest, a lightness that is both terrifying and oddly peaceful. The oxygen machine's hum seems to fade into the background, merging with the sound of his own thoughts. He closes his eyes, trying to decide whether to reach for the envelope or simply drift into the graying light. The room is quiet. Too quiet. It is the kind of quiet that feels permanent, a heavy velvet curtain falling on a stage that has been empty for a long, long time. He hears a floorboard creak, a sharp, clear sound in the silence. It is not the wind. It is not the house. He holds his breath, waiting. The shadow in the corner seems to detach itself from the wall. He doesn't look up. He doesn't scream. He simply waits to see if the door will finally open, or if the silence is the only thing that will ever walk through it. The light continues to grow, bleaching the color from the room, turning the furniture into jagged silhouettes, leaving him in a state of suspended animation, somewhere between the man he was and the nothingness he is becoming, while the world outside begins to stir, unaware that in a room at the end of the hallway, the final frame is still being exposed, though there is no one left to watch it.